Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Brenner. I am Senior VP of Content Strategy here at Cyber Risk Alliance and SC Media, and I welcome you to this webcast sponsored by Brinqa. And joining me today is Alex Babar, VP of Solutions for Brinqa, and we're going to have a conversation about application security posture management as an essential to your business. Before we dive in, just a few quick housekeeping notes. You'll notice a series of buttons underneath myself and Alex. The two on the left are both good if you have a question you want to ask. You just click one of those buttons, type in your question. I'm keeping an eye on the questions during the whole broadcast, and we'll ask them as I see them. And we do have some handouts. And for that, you want to click the handout button, which is second from right, where you see that little rectangle inside the circle. And with that, let us begin. Welcome.
All right. Thanks for that intro, Bill. Hi, everyone. So as Bill said, I'm going to talk to you about application security posture management. Today, we're going to kick things off with a poll. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But before that, I just want to give you a broad overview of the agenda for the day. For some of you, application security posture management might be a new phrase, kind of new concept. So we'll do a poll, kind of understand where the audience is as far as understanding or expertise is in this kind of new area. But essentially, we're going to have two parts, right? We're going to have the first part, like kind of explaining what application security posture management is. I'm always hesitant to use these kind of new cool phrases, with so much buzz in cybersecurity. But, this category has a name, so let's use it. On the other side, really want to kind of tell a story of a Brinqa customer that, like obviously Brinqa will be kind of tied on the technology front, but I want to keep it focused on the problems they had in application security and why application security posture management was the right approach for them and kind of where they were in their maturity during that time. Either way, we're going to focus more on the back end of that, the second of those two options. But to kick things off, let's jump into the poll because I do want to know how much time to spend with you all on the front end. I don't want to belabor something that you guys are already intimately familiar with. And at the same time, I don't want to gloss over something that would really help everyone gain the most out of the second part. If you kind of need and want to learn a little bit more. So with that, I've got a poll up. Just, take your time. We'll spend about a minute or two, maybe waiting. Bill, if you're up for it, I love doing the guessing game while we wait for the poll results. So I'll go with mine first. My assumption going in, just with how new everything is and just what I know, I expect this to be biased towards less familiarity with ASPM or application security posture management, as opposed to a bunch of folks saying, yeah, I'm super familiar, know exactly what you're talking about. But that's my take. What do you think, Bill?
So it's hard for me to answer because I have my eyes fixed on the poll as the results are coming in, which is automatically like clouding my judgment here. But
disqualified. Okay, disqualified.
But I can tell you based on our audience and what they tell us on a regular basis, everyone knows AppSec. Everybody knows DevSecOps. But when it comes to various platforms, with all the acronyms out there, my sense is that there's still a lot for people to learn about ASPM. And that's good because that's why we're here, right?
It is. Yeah, it is. Okay, cool. Well, I think I see the results kind of trickling in now as opposed to kind of coming in a steady stream. So let's not wait. I'm sure everyone's kind of, heavy with anticipation right now. I promise I did not change my answer based on what I saw was coming in. As you'll see with the slides, I did think that part of this would be just helping folks understand and kind of like cut through the kind of noise out in cybersecurity, in particular in AppSec, right? With all the acronyms, all the new stuff going on. So here's what I see. I see about 53% of the group said basically this webinar is the first they're even hearing of ASPM. 40% saying that they see ASPM. This is interesting to me. They're seeing ASPM being used, but they're not really confident they know exactly what it means. And I wasn't quite sure what I expected between those first two, because it has gotten trendy. It is on the, in Gartner's hype cycle. It's at the peak of hype, right? And then at the end, looks like we do have a little small portion that's familiar with it and confident that they understand what it is. So I think the numbers speak for themselves. So it's about kind of 90% plus. I'm going to spend just a little bit more time on explaining kind of what it is. So twofold. Like I said, it'll help you all understand the customer story I'll share later, but also just to, I've been on the vendor side for so long. I empathize with you all trying to make sense of all this new stuff that's coming out. Gartner says this, vendor says that. So I think this will just be helpful in my experience for you all to help kind of just unpack some of the stuff that's out there. Anything you want to add, Bill?
No, I was just as I think about it, I think of ASPM as, to me, it sounds like ASPM is more suited to mature AppSec programs. And I think that's something that we're going to want to address as we proceed here. That, this audience, the folks who have shown up, they're from all kinds of company sizes, from a variety of industries. Their titles go up and down, what you would expect to see on a security team. And so the thing they need to know is ASPM something I need, or is my program not mature enough, or there are other factors? So it's helping with that decision-making process by starting with the understanding of. So
yeah, very, very good point. And so we'll address some of that today. So I'll give you kind of like let's call it the foundation first, and then we'll kind of unpack on, hey, if you can get ASPM in a bunch of different flavors, how do you know which flavor of it is the right flavor for you? So before we then kind of get started, I just want to kick it off with a fun little like icebreaker of a game. I'm going to kind of self-identify as someone that maybe doesn't agree with kind of my family, friends, and loved ones on where we want to go for vacation. So why am I talking about this? So when we talk about ASPM, and again, like more on defining that in a second, there's kind of this question in application security, like what is the vision for the program? What are we really trying to do? And the reason I'm talking about vacations here on the side is imagine that, just kind of self-reflect. Maybe you're like me, or maybe I'm just a market of one and I'm too much of a diva on these family vacations. But, I have a loved one that always wants to go to Disney World. So always telling me all the cool stuff we could do at Disney World. So I have that kind of intake of data, right? Oh, we can do this. There's a new ride there. But I'm not fundamentally sold on going to Orlando to begin with. I'm more of a beach guy, right? And so here's kind of the fun picture to look at. So when we think of like the business analogy to this, well, security is trying to reduce risk, right? The kind of business GM owners are trying to drive revenue. The kind of development teams building these applications are trying to ship features. And so everyone's kind of headed to a different place. And it gets hard to have productive conversations sometime when not everyone's aligned on what are you actually trying to do and why. And the reason you're going to see once we kind of unpack ASPM a little bit is historically application security has been a little bit synonymous with all the detection tools I have in place to identify all the risk along my software development like pipeline. But it's really a very tool-centric view of risk. So you're going to hear me use that phrase over the course of the day, as opposed to a more business-centric view of risk. And so that's going to be a key theme today, not just for like kind of the problem that ASPM sets out to solve for, but also the particular customer story I'm going to present to you all kind of later on. On that note, we're not doing another poll, so just self-reflect, just how hard it is to make these detailed decisions when you're not even agreed fundamentally on where it is that you want to go, and how productive can those conversations really be? It's almost kind of like banging your head against the wall in my experience. So on that note, let's talk about a little bit about maturity and stuff that I believe you all would be more familiar with. So let's talk about software categories. So we have application security as like let's call it the program, the software category. It's a lot of things, right? It's very big and broad. Now, if we break that down There's a very important category in there called AST, application security testing. It's been around for a while. Gartner does a magic quadrant on it. Forrester just released a variety of Forrester waves on specific kind of scanning engines, if you will. SAST, static application security testing, SCA, software composition analysis, like you name it. And so this has been around for a while, right? It's a pretty mature category, and it's grown. It kind of started maybe a little bit, this was the right thing to do, but there wasn't a kind of pent up demand to, like, over the course of those years, you have to do this or you will be fined with such and such. And now it's like, I've got to get my SAST scans in. I've got to get my SCA scans in. So this is kind of where Bill mentioned earlier, but it's kind of a good place to talk about maturity, where everyone's on a different level of that journey in application security. But the kind of amount of detection tools and the sophistication of your detection capabilities along that CI/CD pipeline is really an indicator of how mature you are. The thing is, as you grow in number of tools, oftentimes they're not coming from that single source or a single vendor or a single product. It's coming across a bunch of different tools that are kind of basically speaking different languages. And as you mature, you create this problem, like an anti-pattern exists, where now I've just got more and more stuff from more and more sources, and it becomes harder and harder to understand what the bigger picture is of what I'm trying to do. So going back to that tool-centric view of risk, so I'm maybe trying to hit my critical, quote, SAST findings because the tool told me to, as opposed to, and this is going to be the theme in, like, for ASPM and also the story we tell later, as opposed to a business-first view of risk, i.e., like, what are we really trying to do? What's the job to be done here? The job is to reduce the risk to the business for the application that we're delivering. And so that could be the SAST scan, it could be the SCA scan, but taking a holistic view of the application, and then, like, to go even broader, of the business, there's a level of work that isn't like your kind of textbook AppSec. It's just kind of business prioritization. Let's do the relative business importance of the applications that we're seeking to protect. So that's a lot about what application security testing is, a lot of hinting about application security and posture management. So there's a lot of overlap here. That's really why this is so challenging to unpack. So if you're kind of going and talking to any vendor across these two categories, and there's at least 2 dozen, like more than that, at least 10, you're going to hear a lot of people say, hey, you need to prioritize your findings, because that's what people really care about right now. Maybe you want to consolidate your findings. You want to, report on your findings. You want to automate remediation on your findings. But the thing is that kind of fundamental approach of prioritizing, remediating, and reporting on this stuff, dictated by that source tool. So yes, if I have, a particular SAST scanner, I'll follow that process along my SAST scans. I'll separately follow that same process, albeit with some differences, on my SCA results and on my pen test findings. But this is now becoming like repeated functional work that's being done across different data sources, like in a disparate way, as opposed to unifying it. So essentially the success, this is kind of the ironic twist, the success of scanning and detection has now created the new need in the market for how do I put all this stuff together? And the realities of it is, if I'm a application security vendor, like kind of a textbook, AST vendor, Checkmarx being one, they're doing so much great stuff about consolidating in the form of, I have all the scanners you could want under my one umbrella. But there's still a bunch of different sources because you're scanning different things. And the cool thing there is there's even a whole new wave of scanners that are coming. Your secret scanners, your infrastructure as code scanners, I don't know where you are, you could scan the tools in your CI/CD pipeline for misconfigurations, kind of like CSPM, but in the application. And so at some point along that way, folks are running into that problem. It's just too much. And so we'll talk about one of those stories here. Those tools themselves, to be clear, and kind of really help you cut through kind of just the buzz and the jargon, offer some level of, quote, ASPM capability, right? If I'm let's say a smaller enterprise, this is what we're talking about flavors. I'm a smaller enterprise. It's more likely that I can, for example, have my AppSec needs met from a scanning perspective with just one vendor. And if I have just one vendor, maybe the inbuilt application security posture management functionality from that platform is good enough for me. Now, what we're also saying is the way this actually developed in the real world is not every vendor had every scanning engine that you needed at the time that you actually needed it. So while I could in theory do that, the reality is between M&A, just the timing of all this stuff, like I've got SAST, DAST, SCA, these are the big three, but I've got actually 3 different vendors to do it. And those individual vendors don't really build what you call ASPM that's neutral, like vendor neutral. Meaning like one of those vendors is not pulling in the findings from the other one to create that single source of truth. They're very kind of platform focused. So enter ASPM, right? So it's an emerging category, but there is a little bit of traction. And this is why it's really interesting to see where it is in this poll. Especially just, it's kind of like a loaded poll too. I use the latest acronym. So for some kind of history here, just a brief bit, some of you might be familiar with a kind of a category called ASOC, Application Security Orchestration and Correlation. It's a bit of a mouthful. So that was something that Gartner called this concept before May 2023. They have since updated, they've evaluated the market, and they have, what you're seeing here on the right of this slide is what's called an Innovation Insights, a report that they put out when they think that there's a real market opportunity there. Meaning that enough folks are inquiring with them, the analysts, that they want to cover the space. Eventually, as these categories, in case you guys didn't know how the analysts work, these categories, as they mature, grow into a Magic Quadrant. And then as you kind of see on the Magic Quadrant example here on the left, over time, the Magic Quadrant has more and more and more and more leaders in the top right because the problem becomes more and more solved, right? So from like, let's put numbers to it. And this is kind of the cool of like why we have a case study if it's so early, but also why we want to share that back with you all. So you can kind of like learn from someone that did this quote, like, early before it was named. Is about like 1 in 20 is the number of, and again, this report came out in May 2023. 1 in 20 is the number of enterprises statistically that have some sort of ASPM solution already in place. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, the more interesting is the prediction of the velocity of adoption. So Gartner's predicting that's 8x. So basically 4 out of 40% of the market will have adopted an ASPM solution within the next 3 years. And it's really just bred out of this problem. There's just too many vulnerabilities. There's too much stuff. So it's not a human scale problem anymore. The backlogs don't work for the security teams. They don't work for the remediation teams. It's not their full-time job to do security bugs, right? They got their kind of day job quote and their vision to ship features, revenue generating features. And so this is why being able to communicate this story at a business first level is becoming more and more important. There's just too much stuff, but also from like a defense. Hey, you've got to not only be able to, on one side, you got to promote, hey, we need to act on this critical stuff. It's really going to put the business at risk. On the other side, it's harder and harder for security teams. They're going to have to play defensive. Well, why didn't you catch this? And since the last couple of years, the cases, liability in some cases, where I knew about it, but I didn't act on it. And so that's making a lot of folks nervous. So they're trying to kind of keep track in a very regimented way of, look, we knew about it. We didn't act on it because we had these compensating controls in place. It wasn't likely to be exploited. And so I was kind of leaving those breadcrumbs in case the worst case were to happen. But overall, the whole point in application security posture management is to solve that sort of unification and correlation problem to help you prioritize and triage this stuff to essentially, instead of thinking, I got to remediate 100% of my backlog, and more realistically, I've got capacity to address 3% of that backlog. What 3% do I need to focus on? And then if that's not sufficient, how do I make the business case and have actually data, like real world data to make that business case to justify more investment? So it's like, hey, it's the top 10% we've got to look at because they're bad for this reason. And so far it's been very difficult to do with all the data coming from a bunch of different places. So like to simplify, I'll just kind of run to the next slide and then I'm going to pause. It's really almost that simple. It's aggregating all this stuff into one place, but not stopping there. It's correlating it with other contexts, your business context, your threat context. It's only just be better at prioritizing and triaging which of those detected vulnerabilities from those other tools the business should focus on and kind of help defend that why, right? So kind of internally, for prioritization, but also with remediation teams. When you start saying, hey, this is a, low risk or medium risk vulnerability, but you want a critical SLA tied to it, because on the flagship product that's processing personally identifiable information, it needs to be PCI compliant. That overcomes the remediation challenge of like, hey, I think you're sandbagging, right? And the inverse of that also happens, right? So, how many times have you kind of given a critical vulnerability, it's come back, hey, this isn't really critical, no one can even get to this. And it's just, that's the game we're playing. So this is just essentially a tool, a platform, a software category that's focused on keeping track of that. As far as the last thing I'll say on the different flavors is, because of kind of the needs and the requirements of a solution itself, that's where, hey, if you're smaller, more homogenous as an organization, smaller application security team, you might need a bias to something that's maybe easier to use, more out of the box, and inherently less flexible as a solution. Versus if you're a larger enterprise, very heterogeneous in your environment, you need something that could heavyweight connect with all your data sources and then report on it in the way that you demand and be able to actually model your pretty complex business structure and different ownership structures. So that's where the details matter, way beyond the scope of today. But just so everyone can kind of understand, hey, if you got ASPM, there's still a fair bit of insight you want to kind of think about before kind of pursuing, if any of this sounds interesting to you. So on that, but I'm done with the preamble. I think that was probably a pretty good explanation. Bill, I want to kind of open it up to you, see if you had anything to add or if we had any questions before then kicking it off on kind of just putting this into less of an academic, what is it, and more of a practical, how does someone have value out of this?
Yeah. So no questions from the audience yet. And I will encourage you, the audience, to please submit those questions. This is always a better discussion when you do. A good preamble, but I actually had a question, and I may be jumping the gun here, but I'm going to ask it now anyway. One of the biggest pain points we hear about from our audience, and this has been the case throughout 2023, is just the third-party risk problem. What some consider to be an impossibility when it comes to knowing what all of your partners are doing to keep their end of the pipe secure. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering about the use case for ASPM to deal with that.
Yeah. Okay. So when you say third party, I think you're talking about kind of this whole like software supply chain stuff that's bubbling up, like just the dependencies on your partners. So if I'm misunderstanding, just correct me. But there's two things.
So applications upon applications, right? So you have people who are working for an organization, and some of them are on devices that are a mix of both work and personal. And you have an increasing array of apps that you have to use to do business. And how do you know precisely what the providers of those applications are doing to secure their end of things? And so I look at ASPM and I'm like, okay, this is a way to get more of that visibility. Am I right? Am I off track?
Yes. No, you're right. But I think there's some specific details that will help everyone kind of follow, because there's two very specific use cases that I've seen that I think are worth mentioning here. So one is kind of, I'd say, more spot on to what the question is, and the others maybe an opinion around the concept as a whole that I've kind of challenged some security leaders I know and kind of what they think about just that. So I'll share both. So one is, so here's some comments. Brinqa, to be transparent, typically sells to larger enterprises. So the challenge for these larger enterprises, they have a lot of partners, and so they're starting to become very concerned with the software they're consuming from their partner ecosystem. And it's almost becoming mandated by the larger enterprise and that kind of then partner ecosystem. Hey, we're not going to do business with you unless you can prove to me that you're running your SAST scans, your SCA scans, that you're kind of doing application security. the kind of detail there that's very interesting as far as like ASPM is concerned. So we've been tagged into a particular use case where it's really just funneling in data, but it's not answering my actual question, which is how risky are you as a partner? And that's a very difficult question to ask, but there's like a kind of inbuilt maturity to answer that question. So, hey, if you're don't just throw 5, different security finding results from 5 different scans my way and expect me to deal with it. They're using, let's say, like this almost kind of interesting use case where you have an ASPM solution as an intermediary, where that's then built to report on more specifics that they're looking for. Here, that like application view of their risk. Here's where the biggest risks are. The trends, realistically, there's always going to be some risks in there. So it's more about, hey, are the trends alarming? Are they, encouraging? How's that look? And then the last thing I'll answer on there, where it's like it's a very complicated problem from what I've seen, is then there's the kind of access controls to that data. So it's getting into, because what you're scanning is the code, where kind of the larger enterprise doesn't actually want access for legal reasons to the underlying code. And then for security reasons, it's different to give access to the actual scanning engine versus like an abstracted layer over top, which is really just the reporting of the underlying kind of scanning engine. It's just like who has access to the actual lines of code. So we're seeing that as, like, I call it emerging though, like it's popping up, but it doesn't seem to be so mainstream. The interesting thing, this is going to segue into point 2, Bill, is I have some background kind of in that kind of like third party problem that predates Brinqa. I was very interested, asked kind of one of our former Brinqa customers. I mean, former as in they're still a Brinqa customer as the account, but he's taking a role as a CISO elsewhere, right? Smaller company. So kind of stay in touch with him and asking him about that use case, what he thought about it. And his perspective is not what I expected. I thought he'd be like, oh, that's cool. Just kind of like tech geeks, like, hey, this is a cool thing. He actually provided a very different response. So he's like, his was, why is there so much focus on the partners when I guarantee you the first party code and everything else is full of just problems solved? And so that's a little bit of just a tendency that we're seeing on the ASPM side, right? There's over the last 5 years, there's been kind of like almost like a detection obsession of, I just got to find more stuff. I'm obsessed with the unknown unknowns. I'm obsessed with the idea of a risk. But you know what? Because we weren't where we are today, where we were 5 years ago, we have so much information. So that's where kind of like on that maturity scale, it's like that we're seeing more and more folks kind of self-reflect and say, you know what? I have enough information right now to tangibly reduce risk. And yes, there'll always be that balance of kind of future risk and where that is. But let me kind of correlate, like take in all that I know about myself, kind of fix my own home, so to speak, and focus there in a very tangible way before I kind of, worry about the partner side. And it's still there as back of mind. Is it, the perspective of one person. But I just thought it was like super interesting and ties directly, I think, to what you're saying, Bill.
Yeah. We actually have a question from the audience, and I'm going to ask it now, even at risk of it jumping the gun, because we have plenty more slides to go through. But the question is, this person sees that specific cybersecurity tool companies would want to become an ASPM to be at the forefront on the customer's mind. But what questions would be good to address to determine if that is distracting or a critical path to development?
So I answer it like this. I say, before asking the there's an introspection of,
I think we lost him.
That they could solve all my problems. In which case, like, and so on the Brinqa side, we kind of firmly believe, based on what we see, everyone's going to try and rule the world and offer all the things, but you then become kind of the jack of all trades, master of none. And so there's two things to kind of look. And again, before talking with the vendors, what I'd say is, if I'm on the scanning side of the world, it's a gravity for me. So I always want to do more around remediation, but I'm really heavily focused and competing on being able to detect the next thing. I've got security research teams investing on what that next thing is. There's always a next thing. And it's, in my experience, it's kind of taken priority over the doing something with what you have. Whereas now you have this new kind of category of software that's just super focused on give me all your data and we'll make sense of it. And so going back to the case that we're about to talk to, I said they have no near-term intention, even though they can, to consolidate their SAST and SCA. It's two different vendors. And there's a lot of practical reasons for that. So that's why I'm saying, like, introspectively, here's the big question. So here's the question then to ask once you kind of look introspectively is, what is your roadmap to ingesting findings from other tools that I'm using? And then part of that, the reason that's so important is again, like, keep the context in mind that we're more to large enterprises. You go through M&A. There's such little control that you have over like what you end up with, that the ability for that kind of neutral ASPM vendor feels like it's emerging. That said, it's also maybe worthwhile shouting out to, like, especially like kind of smaller enterprise, some of these ASPM vendors that are a little bit more kind of down market than Brinqa are working to build in some of these scanning detection capabilities. So while the question came from, hey, I've got like an existing kind of AST vendor that's adding on ASPM functionality, you've got some folks that are building in, hey, I do ASPM, but I also do SAST scanning, or I also do SCA scanning. And it's just one of those, like what do you need by when? The last thing I'll say, and then like we should move on for time, is just the level of advanced capability that you need to solve your problem. So it's one thing to kind of say, hey, I'll give you a real world example. We partner with Checkmarks, so we're strategic partners. We announced that earlier this year in June on the Brinqa side. But the use case, the reason we got tagged in is because while Checkmarks does reporting, the advanced requirements for reporting in this particular enterprise, they needed and wanted a Brinqa along for that ride. So there's like within the kind of remediation capabilities, within the prioritization capabilities, within the reporting capabilities, you kind of like, how deep do you need to go? So if you're more shallow and broad, that's one where I kind of expect, like, that's the introspection you do. The question to the vendor is essentially, once you assess on your own side, like, how far do you go? Like, do you have this functionality? That sort of thing. Cool. All right, let's move on. So we'll make this a little bit more real. Let's talk about this Brinqa customer. They wanted to. It's always hard in cybersecurity. So they wanted to share. I personally am a fan of them because in my mind they're visionaries, right? Like, this just got a name. They've been doing this for a couple of years with us. At Brinqa, we used to just call this vulnerability management for application security because that's all it was to us. And now it's, hey, there's a name tied to it. There's a category tied to it, and that means something. But in the interest of helping, their peers out, they chatted with me on the story. How it is the legal approvals, the showcasing kind of, the potential vulnerability security risk inherent to, I don't want other folks out there that might have nefarious actions in mind to know about, like, my house. So we're abstracting this. So just context, important context. Again, like, think of what I was saying earlier. This is a larger enterprise, publicly traded company, right? So large, complex business, a lot at risk, brand reputation on top of just kind of the inherent security risk. But they're running into some problems. And so this is where the maturity level kind of struck them, right? And so first is, hey, they're growing a program. It's new. We've got to do it, kind of catching up. And then next thing you know, I built up my war chest. And we'll talk more about that. But now the new problem is, okay, it's not knowing about stuff, it's making sense of what I supposedly know about. Like, that's the blocker. It's actually remediating the risk, not just identifying the risk. Secondly, there's the need to map this to the business. So this is what I said earlier, take this business first approach. So say they were struggling to take their SAST findings, their SCA findings, and map it to the business because those tools themselves are typically devoid of that business context. And so we'll talk about like the business side of correlating that context on an ASPM solution and how that helps and help them specifically. And then lastly is maybe like kind of the biggest pain point, but from kind of my perspective, it's really derivative of the first 2 points we just talked about. It's just reporting so difficult. That's usually where folks are very focused. How do I make reporting easier? But the kind of like reality of it is, reporting is easier when you got a good foundation. Reporting is very, very, very hard if that foundation is shaky, if it's a bunch of disparate sources. So it sounds like an easy problem. Let me just go buy a reporting tool. It's like, well, does that really solve all these underlying complexities of the fact that it's coming from so many different data sources, being so many different languages, and not really understanding my business? So those are the three key problems they had. And so how we're going to kind of use this over the next, 10 or so minutes, just kind of breaking down the different stages that they were, kind of what the problem was, kind of how they solved and the value they got. And so there's all kind of that ASPM context. So, Bill, unless there are any more questions, I'm just going to keep charging ahead, and just feel free to interrupt me if something pops up.
Keep going.
All right. We're in the clear. So let's start here on unifying application security findings. Right. So they had a SAST scanner, SCA scanner, pen test results, and bug bounty program. They wanted all these findings in one place. So it's really just 4 things. Like I said earlier, the SAST scanner and the SCA scanner are actually 2 different vendors that they're using for their own reasons. So 4 disparate data sources that was causing problems to them. And like, now let's see, like, the problem is, like, I've got a bunch of stuff. I just want it in one place, and I want to be able to report on it. It's like that simple. The challenge with that is it's a much more complicated problem to solve than just, oh, here you go, here's a magic solution. So, they were struggling with multiple UIs. Okay, 4 things. I got to log into 4 different things. I've got to kind of massage the data either mentally or like actually, scripting or coding or just, pivot tables or whatever to kind of make it make sense. There's, like I said, like, kind of devoid of business context, just a bunch of exports. And then you have other problems of, like, in particular, like it getting stale. There's now time dated. It's not continuously updated like it would be in an ASPM platform. At least it would in Brinqa. And so really what it offers is pretty simple. It's a single source of truth, right? And so it's not as easy as it sounds. It's not as simple as just getting all the data in there. It's as all these AST vendors improve their solutions, add more things, update their APIs, there's a level of effort in kind of staying up to date with getting all that data in and getting it in a way that you can, like, track down, if something is wrong, is it on the scanning problem or is it on the kind of, ASPM side of the world? It's just moving data around, right? And then it's like, what do you want to do with that? Well, I actually want to correlate it with other stuff. And since those scanning tools themselves, this is where centralization comes in. Like, maybe they could report, but they can only report on their own stuff. Or maybe they could help you with automating remediation, but they can only do it with their own stuff. So now you've got, a bunch of different processes doing the same thing. Whereas on a Brinqa side, so where we help them is, hey, you got one single source of truth, plug your 4 things into this one bucket, so to speak. That bucket on a technical level is really a single graph database while your stuff is going. And then we'll get to it in the next slide, but layering business context onto it, layering threat context onto it, doing things like prioritization with that. And now I'm doing prioritization in one place off of kind of like a kind of converted, normalized source of data. So that's where the ASPM kind of software comes in, right? It's giving you all the kind of tooling to do that. At the same time, there's some specific implementation nuances you might have. So it's not as easy as, hey, do you integrate with this? It's kind of having the muscle in your provider, tell them, hey, do you integrate it with this in this way? We have a bunch of custom attributes that we have a very unique implementation of this scanner. Do you have the flexibility to support that? So going to move on, because kind of like pair these 2 slides is now correlating it to business context. So the missing piece here is there's another kind of key source of data in enterprises or in tribal knowledge in the form of the business context. So often it's like in a CMDB, maybe it's an asset criticality list, and there's different sources of this data, how the business is actually structured, that, and on the way Brinqa solves the problem that our customers provide. So this particular customer has that knowledge. What they couldn't find was a tool that could model the structure of their business in that kind of single source of truth so that they could correlate it across all those vulnerabilities. So they one of the first things they did is they created the priority to take this business first view of risk. But tactically, what that meant was they needed a tool that could model their multiple product lines. So think like publicly traded companies. So it was very complex. They call them projects, not products. But they want to model all of that and then correlate the context of what finding is tied to what asset, which is part of what product line, right? So that's where it's emerging of the technologies because of the scale of the problem. and also kind of just extracting codifying tribal knowledge almost, right? And tapping into data sources that are already there, and then keeping track of it at scale, right? So let me kind of unpack, like it's not a new solution conceptually. It's like, look, I've got a SAST scan from here, but now manually I go figure out who's the remediation owner for that before I can even create the ticket to send it over. Versus like in a Brinqa, for example, so this particular customer, what they ended up with, you can find that specific vulnerability in Brinqa in your ASPM solution. It's tagged that it was sourced from that particular SAST scan. And then in that one view, immediately I can see, here's my remediation owner tied to this. And then that scales out. So every time I go to a vulnerability, it's tagged. So when something's out of date and I go fix it, now it updates again. It's more like a programmatic approach. So this is the kind of key, like I'd say, like underpinnings of what they were trying to build and what they were trying to solve was really to do, other stuff. And what I mean by other stuff is prioritizing those findings. So this is, if you think kind of, this is the foundation. Hey, I've got everything into one, we call it a cyber risk graph here at Brinqa. That's not ever the end goal. Like the end goal is to fix the problems, but there's still so many problems, right? So how do you have prioritization built in? So where this customer is, they haven't had a chance to implement threat intelligence into their prioritization mechanisms yet, but that's their next step. So there's a lot of really cool stuff coming out as far as like how reachable, how exploitable things are. There's so right now they're evaluating, do they want to adopt, EPSS, exploit prediction scoring system, or do they want to kind of, adopt bring in the CISA known exploited vulnerability database like telemetry. And again, this is another thing that now that you have that foundation built, you can correlate kind of programmatically and at scale from an ASPM solution. So this is where all kind of the hard work in building the tools is coming from. And so, before it's like doing all this in either just good enough in spreadsheets, or actually there's companies out there building this stuff themselves, because before there weren't enough, providers that solve their problems. And so on that note, so once they set that foundation, this is more Brinqa specific. So where they're excited is, hey, it's really just layering, right? At this point, because the foundation is solid, just adding another data source. You don't have to boil the ocean, but it's being more kind of introspective, like what's my biggest problem now, and continuing to add, but have that platform that you could build all this on as you evolve your program as well, because they're also kind of building more, subject matter experts are so hard to come by in application security. So yeah, I want to do it, but I need another head, I need another FTE to run that we're going to do exploitation kind of based prioritization. So I also need the people tied to it, right? I need to build a process.
Question from the audience that I think is worth breaking in for. Is it right to assume that they want deduplication, correlation, and prioritization?
I think it's safe to assume it. Where it's hard for me, it's just like if you're feeling kind of jobs to be done, it's like really what they want is to more precisely reduce the stuff that's posing risk to the business. As far as how you do it, yeah. So in Brinqa, for example, what they get out of it, we pull in all the vulnerability data, then we pull in also as part of that the asset data, and then deduplicate all those assets to build a kind of good asset inventory tied to that. So the cyber risk graph, it has like continually updated like asset context, like asset criticality context, vulnerability context, and then this kind of threat intelligence piece of the puzzle. And those are kind of like the big three. And a lot of folks have the tools already. That's why I was saying it from an ASPM kind of flavor perspective and kind of assessing what's right for you. If you're a larger organization, you probably adopted these tools already. And that's our experience in Brinqa. You already had like a Mandiant or Recorded Future or something like that. Versus when you get kind of more in like a smaller enterprise, maybe you actually need that functionality out of your ASPM vendor natively, right? You don't have those things yet. It's kind of like a difference between bring your own or kind of, get it all at once. On that note, so this would be a really good segue to this slide, though. So what were they really trying to do in reducing risk? There's still like all the low level details of like what happens there and how do you do it. So they had a specific problem they share with me. So specific vulnerability could be anything. In this case, it was a cancellation token problem, I believe, where they could, in theory, go to the scanning tool and query the scanning tool to find and detect these things. I don't know the details, but from what they told me, it was just hard to do. It was hard to do, and then it was also devoid of that business context. Where in Brinqa, it's not just or your ASP. I say it should be in your ASPM, but in Brinqa specifically, we build the cyber risk graph, but also it's so you can query it, so you can answer these questions. Where is this? And then kind of immediately have not just where's the cancellation token, but just in one view, can I just see who do I need to talk to about it? And like how much like at a high level does it impact the business? Is it a flagship product or some sandbox? Is being able to answer that more quickly, more easily. So the cool thing here is so one is the usability. So it's being able to find this stuff much more quickly. So use kind of their new graph database or new cyber risk graph to be able to do this and navigate that and assess and crawl. But what they got out of it was building credibility with their stakeholders. And what I mean by that is if they kind of stayed with the way they used to do it, they wouldn't have had the higher level kind of macro view to see what they ended up seeing, which was that this was actually a systemic problem. So instead of, kind of like old state would have been remediation ticket to team A, remediation ticket to team B, remediation ticket to team C. And you're actually sapping, it's like death by a thousand cuts, a lot of resources from both your team and the remediation teams. Whereas because they took this macro view, they were actually able to identify the kind of systemic problem. Hey, we've got a problem here. Create like a spike, like an initiative to let's go solve this. And to take that case to their, kind of business owners for justification to the remediation teams, was just a fundamentally different way to go about solving that problem and build credibility with those stakeholders. Just the political capital needed to say, hey, this is what we're going to do, and this is why it's a problem. It's a problem for the business. So let's unpack that a little bit. It might be a little problem for product line A. It might be a little problem for product line B. It might be a little problem for product line C. But you elevate that conversation. This is a big problem for the business, though. And so that's where this business first view, and that's why they were trying to do that, why they wanted a tool that could help them pull all that stuff together. And again, it's to really just reduce risk to the business and not just kind of like remediate tickets, right? Like, yes, you're going to remediate tickets. Yes, you want to do less of that. You want to do less and less critical vulnerabilities in your enterprise. But you want to be able to tie that back to, we're on progress to reduce more criticals for product line A. And that means more to us than product line, if they're sequential in priority, product line Z, right? Let's focus our efforts there. And that kind of goes up to naturally to reporting, right? So you have all this stuff, you have the strong foundation built, and it becomes much easier to share the story here. And this is just like one of those like real practical things of having different sources of data, different tools you're working with, no single source of truth. But then it's just hard, right? You've got business owners that don't know the first thing about security. You've got maybe the remediation or the dev teams that might or might not know or care about security. But if you're too high level with them, it's not actionable. What line in the code do you need me to go look at, right? So getting all this in one place, think you could traverse it up and down. So in Brinqa, you actually can natively build those reports. This is what they were looking for, and configure them to suit them. And so this is where, again, like flavors and ASPM matter. With our customer base and the folks that seek out Brinqa, they have their own way that they're looking to report on something. So they need the configurability to create that report, that template, to then report on how they need to, as opposed to asking the vendor to come out, hey, we should report like this, right? Because as you get larger and larger, it becomes more bespoke as far as like, a Fortune 500 company A or B or C, they're reporting differently, but they all need reporting and they all want it from the same tool. But now imagine that when you give that executive level overview of not, here's a cancellation token, their eyes gloss over, but product line A, the flagship product of the business, has 10x more critical vulnerabilities than product line B. That doesn't matter how security conscious you are, like it raises flags. And so it kind of naturally creates those security champions of, well, why aren't we doing, what can we do to do about this? And the cool thing for them is actually creating a little bit of a kind of competitive gamified culture, because now you have the GM of product line B bragging to the GM of product line A, hey, I'm way more secure than you. I got a better score on the security test. So it's kind of like naturally motivating in the way that they're motivated, but it retains, like through the platform, through the reports, to drop down to the low actionable level that you need for them to then go work with the development team, with the remediation teams. So that, we can take that, hey, of those, many, many criticals, how do we then click down, and get to the actual remediation instructions for the specific vulnerability on the specific asset, and do that like up and down in one platform, one place, as opposed to, hey, it's a spreadsheet here, it's an export there, I'm in one tool here, now I'm tracking in Jira over there, all that sort of, not so fun stuff. Let me pause there. Like it's pretty much the story I wanted to share with you. There's a couple other tidbits I'll add here at the end. But before I wrap up, this is a great place to kind of just pause, see if there's any questions before we let you guys go.
So, how long does it take to get Brinqa up and running?
Yes, a great question. So, kind of like how I answered that other one of kind of introspectively looking. Okay, it's a similar concept. There's like, how big are you trying to go? So think about it this way. If I want to do this program wide for application security, it's going to take longer than if I just want to do this for my SAST scanning results. So there's that kind of scope element, right? So what we do at Brinqa is try and take, hey, we can get you here to this end goal. This often, so in application security posture management, the vision is typically we want to do it across all our application security findings. And that's where we focus there. Just kind of be transparent. On the Brinqa side, we go beyond that, by the way. So we also take in your infrastructure, your cloud findings. We call it a risk operations center. It's beyond the scope of today, but essentially, like, you know, what folks really want, we're seeing is a convergence of, at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of vulnerabilities, and the difference between infrastructure and cloud and applications getting more and more gray, because really, just where does the application end, right? Is it the code? Is it the containers? Like, is it the VMs? Like what actually is it? So on the highest level, we have customers, it takes a while because we're trying to get them there, and that's where they want to go. But in the interim, to get almost the other way is, how far could you get in 90 days? It's usually how we kind of tackle that problem. How far can you get in 180 days? And then there's a little bit of a conversation. So it's just a hard question to put a number to, because let's take this specific example. Well, how organized are you on your end of understanding your business structure that we would then model into Brinqa? Right. So we'd want to have those conversations during, you know, like POCs, so we could prove it out. You know, for you all, it's usually, you know, what folks want, or then on the implementation side to make sure we're on the right track. But the reality is still there's a lot to do. Right. So I got to kind of pull in my business data. I want to integrate my key data sources, 4 of them. Which one goes first? So from a kind of time to value perspective, think more, we look to kind of scope that, kind of assess like, hey, what's the right path to go through all this? And then coordinate, like as a partner, you know, more than just a vendor, of how can we kind of meet your speed as an organization based on how fast you guys can go.
Got it. So we are approaching the end of our time, but I think I can squeeze in one more question. First, let me check and see if there's one from the audience. And there is. So this will be the last question. And thank you to the audience, by the way, for the questions that you've asked throughout this. So you mentioned Jira, Alex. What's the current status of ASPM integration with bug tracking and engineering change systems?
Oh, very good question. So in particular in application security, it's almost like there's a violent reaction to forcing developers to work in a tool that they're not already working in. So from an ASPM perspective, what that means is let's touch on what remediation actually means from an ASPM perspective. It does not typically mean patching or fixing. It means kind of creating the ticket. And so let's say like the way Brinqa solves this, for example, you actually create a ticket in Brinqa, 9 times out of 10, that ticket's there for technical reasons to be able to like validate that tickets are actually fixed and kind of automatically close tickets that maybe have been rescanned. We know that's not really a thing, to kind of get out of like all the noise and clutter. But the typical use case of an enterprise is they're working in their Jira, their Azure DevOps, like whatever their ITSM tool is that they're already using, that's where the remediation teams are actually living. And so on the Brinqa side, on the ASPM side, what that looks like is a bidirectional integration with those ticketing systems. Or think like from a kind of technical level, you'll create the Brinqa ticket, but like I said, 9 times out of 10, that's just going to be a kind of correlated to some Jira ticket, some Azure DevOps ticket, some Bitbucket ticket, some whatever system they're using. But the thing I want to mention is because ASPM sits in the middle of the ticketing tool and also the scanning tool, it's in a very special spot where you can do these things like how many times, just because the ticket is closed doesn't mean they actually solve the problem, right? So you can create alerts on the security side of, hey, ticket was closed. Let's trigger a rescan just to double check, or just the kind of the noise. People don't close out tickets. They solved the problem, but they didn't close it out. So this all goes into what we're saying about reporting, right? Like, oh, look at all these like vulnerabilities. Turns out those weren't vulnerabilities. Those were unclosed tickets that were already remediated, and the details start mattering here. And then you lose your credibility, when you're banging your fist on your table trying to get buy-in from stakeholders because they're like, it's all out of date. Like, it's another reason not to trust someone. It's another reason to get out of doing something that I'm not predisposed to do. So a little bit of a long answer, but I think the context is probably helpful for whoever asked that question.
Got it. And, this has been a great audience. Lots of questions have come in. There are a few we're not going to have time to get to, unfortunately, though we can email them out to you and you can provide an answer post-event. So for those whose questions we didn't get to, that is something that we can do. So, but this was great. This was great. So thank you, Alex. Thank you to Brinqa for sponsoring this. And again, great audience. Thank you guys for showing up. We know it's the middle of a busy workday and there are a lot of other things you can be doing with your time. And you spent an hour with us. So thank you.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate that. Thanks to everyone for having me. If you want to learn more, feel free to find me on LinkedIn. Hit me up if you want to, if you prefer that. But otherwise, here's a QR code to our website if you want to learn more. And just to kind of reiterate, like I said, we solved this problem on the AppSec side. We also solved this problem on the more infrastructure security side. And we're the only vendor that kind of does this both together and can do it at scale, which you can see with some of our happy customers here presented to you below. With that, that's all I had for you all today. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Be well, everyone.